Thank you. As I said, I'm very happy to be here to have the opportunity to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Joseph Cronin. And I can say that I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Cronin for many years and have followed his work. So I can tell you that you're in for a treat this evening. He's going to talk about his recently published book, Reforming Boston Schools, 1930 to 2006. And the subtitle is Overcoming Corruption and Racist Segregation. His book is an important history, not only for the history of Boston, but also for the history of and issues related to urban public education and the struggles that Boston has gone through and many communities have gone through to improve the delivery of educational services. Dr. Cronin is uniquely qualified to tell this story. He began as a researcher a few years ago, back in 1964, when he was a research assistant working with the Carnegie Foundation and the U.S. Office of Education, looking at the issue of school boards and urban school decision making. He then became a professor at Harvard University, and among his activities there was to be the director for the Danforth Foundation's study of the Boston school decision-making process between 1968 and 1971. Dr. Cronin then in the 1980s ran the State Education Loan Corporation, but he also chaired the Boston Plan for Excellence in Boston. In 1971, he was appointed by Governor Sargent to be the Secretary for Educational Affairs in the Commonwealth. And then following that position, he moved to Illinois, where he was the State Superintendent for Education between 1975 and 1980. He has served as a president of Bentley College, Dean of Lesley University's School of Education, and he's also served as a consultant for many boards and many organizations in the area of education. If you have the opportunity, and I hope you do, to read this book, it really gives a valuable insight into education reform. Dr. Cronin, as they say, knows where the bodies are buried. The detail about the individuals involved, the decisions that were made, particularly telling, and really give a feel for what it's like to try to bring about change in an urban educational system. As I read the book and as I've got to know the work that Dr. Cronin has done, it brought to mind a couple of anecdotes. One was when I was much younger. I remember going to dinner, Thanksgiving dinner as a matter of fact, with at my aunt and uncle's house. And at that time my uncle served as a custodian in the Boston Public Schools. And he was relating the fact that he was nervous because the following week he had to appear at a meeting of the Boston School Committee because he had applied for a transfer from one school to another. And I asked him, I said, let me get this straight. You have to go before the school committee to get approval for a transfer from one school to another as a custodian? He said, that's right. I have to go before the school committee. And I thought to myself, my uncle's a wonderful guy, but he's not politically connected. He's not somebody who knows how to push the levers. So needless to say, he didn't get the transfer. So I've seen one aspect of how things operated in the Boston Public Schools. I will also say that I bring a biased viewpoint because I had the opportunity under Mayor Menino to serve as a member of the Boston School Committee. And I watched how, as an appointed member, after we had moved away from the elected committee, politics really was not a part of the decision-making process. Not that there weren't challenges, but politics was not part of the process. It was about how do we make schools better? How do we better serve the public? And Dr. Cronin has told that story in this new book. So I commend it to you. As he will note, that process in Boston has been successful to the extent that in 2006, the Boston Public Schools received the Eli Broad Award as the most improved urban school system in the country. So to tell us about the story, the transformation between the years 1930 and 2006, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Joseph Cronin. Before he begins, I have one other item I'd like to mention, just to thank everyone who worked to organize this evening's event. A lot of people worked hard to make this happen, and I especially want to thank Dr. Wakeling and the university libraries for their work, John Ports from the College of Political Science that's been involved with us, as well as the Northeastern University bookstore. So thanks to all of you for making this possible. Dr. Cronin.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
The title, Reforming Boston Schools, about halfway into it I thought I better define reforming, efforts to improve or to eliminate bad features. And the ones that I concentrate on are overcoming financial corruption and racial segregation. Bob is right on. The custodians, when the Boston School Committee members were elected, the custodians were a very important force, and the most politically active would actually take signs around the city and put them up about 15 or 20 feet so no one could tear them down. Now, custodians knew how to do ladders. That was their comparative advantage. But they would also go to the little social hours. Each school committee member, to raise money, would invite the teachers and the custodians and secretaries and other workers and say, I'm celebrating my birthday next month. And for $10 you can have a ticket, and please come on by because I hope to have hundreds of people, you know, times $5 or $10. In those days, it was, towards the end, it was $25 or $50 to go to these political times that they were called. And lo and behold, whether or not you got appointed to a principalship or a headmastership in the high schools may depend in part on whether or not there were 2 or 3 school committee members who said, oh yes, he comes to all my events, all my fundraising events. And a fellow named Higgins, who was a novelist on Boston, who wrote 1 or 2 nonfiction, said many of these folks were lawyers who got tired of doing divorce settlements and wills, and they thought being on the school committee was really kind of fun because they could control the fate of hundreds of teachers and wannabe principals, custodians, and others. It wasn't a board of education, it was a board of educational employment. That's where they spend 80–90% of their time, right into the 1980s. And the notion that they should be working on other issues like educational improvement, productivity, achievement, racial balance in the schools, it occurred to them, but they said, well, there's no future in that. No one's going to contribute if we, for those purposes, and they would revert to their old habits of deciding who was going to be promoted and who to get the plum jobs. Secretaries, for example, their initial job might be, they might live in Dorchester and they get a job in Charlestown, and they would be watching for openings so they could get closer to home because their commute would be reduced. And they weren't loyal to the school. This to them was an employment system. The other issue, racial segregation, very serious in really all of the cities of the North. Back in the 40s and 50s, we thought segregation was a Southern phenomenon. The early Supreme Court cases all had to do with Southern schools, and we in the North sort of looked down our noses that there was, in some cases, violence or difficulties or protests, until in the 1960s, efforts began with the NAACP to desegregate. New Rochelle and Boston and New York City and Chicago were viewed as rather large, perhaps impossible, but Buffalo and Rochester, other places were under the glass as well. All the kind of excitement and dissension that surrounds gay marriages or gays in the military in this decade was focused on racial equality, racial segregation. And the NAACP in Boston, beginning in the 1930s, was complaining about unequal treatment, about being confined to certain of the oldest schools, about guidance counselors saying, forget about going to college. Why don't you get a trade? We've got a Boston trade school and a technical school and something very, very practical for you, and would be discouraging young black men and women from aspiring to a professional career. Worst kind of racism possible. And so much of that has changed. We have not achieved the ultimate in racial balance in the metropolitan area of Boston or in the Boston public schools, but we've gone light years from what we had before. The notion that we're now on our fourth black superintendent in the last 25 years, that was inconceivable when as a 28-year-old graduate student, I was sent 3,000 miles away from Stanford University. Fortunately, Boston was my hometown, where I was born, and I was able to blend in and get all kind of data. And then I finished the book in 2006, 2007, figuring I better write down what I know about the Boston schools while I can remember it. And 45 years working on this theme. Now I have written 3 or 4 other books in the meantime, but this is a 76-year retrospective on what was done to try to improve the Boston schools and make them productive, and to emphasize achievement and equal opportunity for all students. Publisher is Palgrave Macmillan. Most of us don't know Palgrave. It's an outstanding British publisher that acquired the rights to the Macmillan label or brand. And in New York City, about 10 months ago, the book was launched. I'm going to show some slides for about 20 minutes to kind of get you into the mood, especially of the 1960s and 70s, and show you some of the characters who were involved. What happened to our little clicker? It should be right in front of me. Yeah, there it is. It's hiding. Okay, good. The little woman on the left is Ruth Batson, who was a parent who was very angry with the inferior facilities and worked over several mayors to get them. And because she was so effective and articulate, she became chair of the NAACP Education Committee. Here she is having an argument with Ed Brooks, who was the first black African-American Attorney General in Massachusetts, and later the first black U.S. Senator since Reconstruction. He's still alive. He is living in Virginia. They were having a discussion of whether or not it was okay to use school boycotts as an effort to dramatize the plight of black students. And Ed Brooks said, look, there's a compulsory attendance law. I'm supposed to enforce that. Bob has been in the justice field and knows that, I mean, there's a tension between being enthusiastic about your group, your racial or ethnic group, versus being the Commonwealth's chief enforcement officer. When I selected this, it was before Barbara Walters came out with her book on her relationship with Ed Brooks. In Ed Brooks' autobiography, it says he had lunch with Barbara Walters, like once. And in this tell-all book that came out about 4 or 5 months ago, just in time for my slideshow, it came out that they've really spent a good deal of time together. But that's really beside the point. On the right is William Orenberger, who was the superintendent of schools from 1965 to 1973, during much of the commotion. Orenberger tried to do whatever he could. He appointed several black principals, the first black assistant superintendent of the Boston schools, but he had to deal with a woman who was almost, Bill Orenberger was a football player for Boston College. He was about 6'2". So you can imagine Louise Day Hicks was a formidable figure and a very large presence. She chaired the Boston School Committee on at least 4 or 5 occasions and was a fierce opponent of desegregation, of busing, of racial imbalance. She said people in Boston prefer the neighborhood school. And when she ran for mayor, her slogan was, "You know where I stand." Well, that was code for saying the black people will stay in Roxbury in the South End, and the people in South Boston will continue to be a white enclave, and so will West Roxbury and most of Dorchester. And she got a great deal of national attention, was on the cover of Time magazine because she was so vehement in saying we're going to keep Boston the way it always has been, and the The black, there was not that much of a Hispanic community at the time, will be confined to a certain area. And the housing policies, the covenants, supported that. Here Louise Day Hicks is addressing an anti-busing rally, and to her right is William Berger, who at the time was a state representative and then became state senator, president of the Massachusetts State Senate. And then he and Governor Bill Weld developed a real friendship, and Weld recommended him, and he was appointed president of the University of Massachusetts. To his right, on the edge of the screen, is school committee member Gerald O'Leary, who went to jail because he tried to work some contracts to get some kickbacks. This was the corruption theme. The corruption began in the 1930s when jobs were scarce, and some school committee members said, look, if you pay me $1,000, I think I can move your name up the list and you can get a job. Well, Jerry O'Leary, who was opposed to busing, was negotiating with the school bus contract to say, I'm a sure vote for the bus contract, but X $1,000 should be placed in a certain drawer in an envelope, and then you can count on me. And actually 3 members of the school committee were indicted because it took 3 out of 5 to get something through. But they didn't have the evidence on the other. And school committee member O'Leary was one of about 5 school committee members over the past 40, 50 years who had to face criminal charges. This is Judge Wendell Arthur Garrity, a U.S. federal judge who was appointed by John F. Kennedy, in whose campaign he had worked back in the 1960s. The W stands for Wendell, which is the same first name as Wendell Phillips, the liberator, one of the great advocates of ending slavery in the 19th century. And that name had been passed down by in the Garrity family. They were, I think, from Worcester. He went to Holy Cross and then Harvard Law School, and he was a meticulous judge. It seemed to take forever to get the decision rendered, and it came in the spring of 1974 to take effect only about 4 months later in September. He was righteous. He hated the notion that he would be overturned in any kind of appeal, and indeed just about all his decisions for the next 12 years were upheld. He was a stickler. If he made a mistake, it was to try to get South Boston, white working class, South Boston High School matched with Roxbury High School, because really neither side felt comfortable in the other community. Most of the desegregation actually took force peacefully. There were then about 150 schools. There were problems at 3 high schools, but most of the elementary schools worked out well. The middle schools worked out well. But we received national publicity because people were throwing stones at buses. People were marching on Charlestown and torching buildings and the like. It was very serious and a great blot on the notion of Boston as the cradle of liberty and the Athens of America. Louise Day Hicks was so popular, so well known, that she ran for mayor, and she ran against Kevin White, who is on the far right, and in the middle is Bob Crane, who was the state treasurer for many years. Kevin White was Secretary of State. Bob Crane was treasurer. This is 35 years ago. They are still wonderful friends and spend time together. Kevin White won actually 4 times. Another key election in the 1980s pitted Mel King, who had been a state representative, who had run for school committees several times. King of the South End. He was a social worker and a great advocate for racial justice. And he was running against the South Boston state representative and city councilor Raymond Flynn. And what was amazing about that election, and I was privileged to observe it, is that they both said, you know, in our school, in the Boston schools, we have got to raise our expectations about students. And that's the whole basis of No Child Left Behind, that George W. Bush will not go down for many memorable expressions. He was lucky to get a sentence out straight at some of his press conferences. But the soft bigotry of low expectations is really the enemy of achievement in our urban school systems. And both Ray Flynn and Mel King advocated that. Now, Ray Flynn had gone to Providence College on a basketball scholarship. He was not a great academic. He later wound up admitted to the Harvard School of Education in a master's program where he was advised by Chuck Willey, a black sociologist. And they had to work a little bit on his writing skills and the like, because he majored in basketball undergraduate. But Ray Flynn developed a sense of what was important and useful in education, and he figured out how to use some of his Harvard professors as advisors. And they modified the original desegregation order, which was kind of rigid. It was done on the basis of police geocodes, and allowed people some choice, controlled choice. Every school had to work towards balance, but you could have a first, second, and third choice. And that was Ray Flynn's advisor, Chuck Willey, who came in and with 2 or 3 other people devised that plan. So Ray Flynn, who everyone thought was an arch conservative and a friend of Louise Day Hicks and a constituent of Senator Berger, turned out to get very upset with the Boston School Committee. He did the work to transform it from an elected to an appointed board so that people like Bob Gittins and Bob Culver of Northeastern could serve. In Boston, there are 8,000 members of the Boston Teachers Union, and for about 18 years, Ed Doherty was the president. And he was a gruff, unhappy-looking guy most of the time. He got so mad at Ray Flynn once he ran for mayor, and I think Ray Flynn got 75–80% of the votes. In private, he was an advocate for constructive change. He was a Boston Latin School parent himself, and he quietly supported some initiatives to make conditions better for children in the Boston schools. He is assistant to the president of the Mass Federation of Teachers. He's sort of like a afterlife. He doesn't have to do the negotiations. Here I am on the right. You won't recognize my hair color, but I am with Owen Cannon, who was the Commissioner of Education in the 1960s, who assembled a panel of clergymen and corporate leaders to propose the end to racial segregation in the Boston schools. I'm going to his 95th birthday party in about 10 days. In 1951, I had a paper route, and my mother said that there's a new superintendent in school. Go down and ask him whether he wants the Boston Globe or the Herald or the Quincy paper or whatever. So I dutifully marched over and said, "I'm your paper boy, and which would you like?" I didn't ask him whether he wanted a paper. He was the superintendent of schools, for heaven's sakes. He had to read. And he remembers, he tells that story now. When you think of it, 57 years later, I was 16, he was about 36 at the time. He then, after he was Commissioner of Education, he became Executive Director of the National Association of School Superintendents, but he had sort of a lifetime franchise to go to meetings of state commissioners of education. I was hosting one in Chicago that time, and we have this great picture. The mentor on the right, and he's one of 3 people that I've dedicated the book to, the mentor and the protege on the left. Notice how the hair color changes 10 years later in this next one. There I am on the... Now that may be my 7 children, my 5 daughters, the 4 weddings I had to pay for, the 19 grandchildren, etc. In the front row, in the middle, is John Nucci, who is currently Vice President of Governmental Affairs for Suffolk University. He's had an exciting 18 months battling with the Beacon Hill Civic Association and now explaining his president's compensation package. Next to him is Laval Wilson, who was a superintendent who was a Calvinist. He believed in hard work. He believed that they should go ahead.
You know something? I was there at the time with all the work I'd done in City Hall with the governor's bill. And you know what? That man was excellent. And I don't know why they didn't keep him here. You know what? You know what happened? I tell you that they didn't want to. The school committee and they didn't want to implement to help to work with him, because when they opened up that Madison school.
Madison Park, yeah.
Remember at the beginning of it, sir? Okay. And there was just a little turmoil of little problem, little boys and girls. And he had the key on how to break that cycle, because he talked to me about it, and I go, yes, this is the man. And they didn't support it, and I believe if they had kept that man, we would not have all this.
Well, that's a vote of confidence for sure, yeah. He was the one who put in longer school day, including Saturdays, and achievement scores at the Timothy Middle School and others went up. And now the whole state is talking about it. There's a state appropriation of about 25 schools have longer days and the like, and he was really a pioneer. Right behind him is Ken Rossano, who was the executive vice president of the Bank of Boston, now part of Bank of America. He was chairman of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and a good partner for me. And he was always luring me into corporate and civic assignments. We were out at in San Francisco at this meeting, explaining what Boston was doing through the Boston Compact, the Boston Plan for Excellence, business-supported initiatives to try to improve the schools. This is the only one in color. I told Commissioner Driscoll, luring him to one of my author talks, which he enjoyed. He's announcing the increase in test scores, and both Tom Pezant on his left and Tom Menino should look a little happier, because test scores had gone up for like the fourth consecutive year because of the work that Pezant had done and the excellent political interference that Tom Menino, as an education-minded mayor, provided to Tom Pezant, allowing Tom Pezant to work on curriculum, to get rid of ineffective principles, to put in standards, to implement both the state and national reform. So these are really three heroes. They work together beautifully. I interviewed Tom Pezant on a couple of occasions, and he said, "I'm sorry, I got to take a call from the commissioner," because they were, working out a few things where the state and the city had to agree. A little commentary on the possibility that Boston could have made racial desegregation work more smoothly. Look at going back to the Civil War, 1865, right up till 1920, 1930, the African-American population of Boston was about 2%. It began to increase in the 1950s. At the time when the racial imbalance law was passed in 1964, it was still around between 10 and 12%. That looked manageable. It looked like you didn't have to have 25 all-black schools and 125 schools that were all white. There were a couple of schools that were Asian, just two of them. It looked feasible. It looked doable right into 1970. Especially when you compare it to the racial percentages in other cities. For example, the yellow stands for, well, the bright yellow is Chicago, and you can see those numbers are substantially higher. But Boston, compared to the others, much less concentrated. It was tough for Philadelphia, for New York and Chicago, and LA to desegregate, but the mid-sized cities should have been able to do it. Detroit had the same kind of, a few more numbers because the automobile industry attracted folks from the South. They had just as much turmoil and difficulty as Boston did. This cartoon needs a little explanation. The fellow who's kneeling down in the bottom of the picture has tried to bribe some of the school people over a proposed school construction. And the superintendent of schools and the chairman of the board are trying to drive him out. But look what they're doing. One has a book in his hand, the other one has some like a T-square. Well, no wonder corruption persisted if you were fighting them just with minor league weapons like that. But this was in the American School Board Journal back in the 1930s, which is when the book begins. And I thought this kind of exemplifies. Attacking school corruption is the caption. Little info on myself. I teach part-time at Boston University in the School of Education, and I have an advisor's educational consulting services. I work at EduVentures, and if you want to contact me and continue the discussion, advisors at AOL. advisors. I give advice, not advice. Okay, and that is the slideshow. Part two, I thought I would read you a little bit about what Northeastern has done over the past 30 years to try to improve the Boston schools. One of the wonderful features of Northeastern is in the mission statement, it says friend of the city. Still there, Bob? No other university in Boston comes out and says, we are partners with the city, we care, we want to do things. And of course that has led to the decision by current administration to participate in the Mayor's Step Up program and take on two of the lowest achieving, lowest performing schools in Boston and try to strategize on ways to get educational achievement and opportunity up, which is really wonderful. I also want to say about Northeastern that the help of then Dean of Education, Jim Fraser, was absolutely indispensable for me to put this book together. He lent me his books. He was going to be a co-author, but he had several other requests to write books. He lent me a graduate assistant, Gina Sartori, who I mentioned in the book, who I think is teaching at Madison Park, and did a great deal. He said, this book has got to come out. You got to finish it. So towards the end, I put all the chapters together. But when I had to cut out 50 pages, I said, Gina, you got to help me. And she was ruthless. She told me all the things fun stories that I enjoyed writing. But she said, you don't need those. And so she did a great job in helping me winnow the book and get it down. Back in the 1970s, there was a man named Charles Silberman, and he wrote a scathing indictment of schools. It just shows you how the pendulum goes back and forth. He says, our schools are grim and joyless places. Well, now we're trying to make them more grim, more achievement-oriented. We're putting the grim back in and testing to make sure you get the message. But at that time, the notion was, especially in the high school, there ought to be an open campus, and people ought to have a chance to go out and be in the community and be interns and apprentices and do projects and the like. Now Boston said, open campus, that sounds too loosey-goosey to us. Let's call it the flexible campus. And among the leaders in Boston was a former superintendent of schools named Greg Coffin. He had been in the Evanston Township system in Illinois, and he was on the faculty, and he was the leader. He said, okay, we're going to get all the Boston high schools. They got all the high schools signed up except for Girls Latin. They said, you know, we're about academics. We don't have any time for flexible campus. And the headmistress of that school said, no, thank you. We're going to pass on this one. All the other high schools participated. And that was an early effort in the span of this book for Northeastern to really get involved. In the 70s, I chaired a group of doctoral students and one other professor as we looked at Boston schools. One of the things we looked at was vocational education. Well, Boston had always had terrific programs in sheet metal, carpentry, electricity, and would you believe, agriculture, Jamaica Plain High School. Well, there were a couple of farms in Boston still, and also they said, well, we got to train the people who are going to do the flowers at the public gardens. You know, there was a permanent need for agriculture. So we said, well, you know, there are some emerging fields. How about computer technology? We didn't call it IT at the time, but that was there. And then at Northeastern, there had just been a study by Dean Emmer reporting a shortage of 5,000 health workers in the greater Boston area. So we had a workshop and said, you know, we should add health, the kind of allied health professions, specialties to our Boston schools. Wow, this was a new idea. It was a revelation. And Boston, since that time, has it. But it was a study by a Northeastern professor that paved the way. One of the recommendations that we said was that universities and corporations should get more involved with the schools. They should partner with the schools. They should provide help, advice, other grown-ups, and from time to time some money, because the schools were perennially short on money. Mayor Kevin White thought that was a good idea, and his education advisor, Bob Schwartz, who's still around the city, he's at Harvard, wrote memos to the universities and asked them if they would partner with high schools. And Northeastern decided to participate in that in several ways. For one, Northeastern decided that there would be I Have a Dream scholarships to students at a Mission Hill Elementary School, providing that those students would stay in school through high school. They would get a tuition-free scholarship to Northeastern University. Later, that was expanded to all children who were in Boston Housing Authority projects. Now, although Northeastern back in the 80s abolished the School of Education, it reestablished it as part of the School of Arts and Sciences. Now I think there's a dual arrangement. Some of it's in continuing professional education, maybe the graduate programs. But Northeastern hosted two groups. One is the Teacher Union Reform Network, TURN, which takes the most progressive leaders in the American Federation of Teachers and has them meet several times a year, and there's a newsletter, and they're looking for new ideas to kind of reinvigorate the field of education. Another group said, you know, the superintendents come, the superintendents go. We should be critical friends. We should give them constructive criticism every few months as to what they're doing right, and then especially what they're not doing right. And Northeastern also hosted the Critical Friends. Is that still going on? I haven't heard of it in the last year or two. In 1991, the mayor was very upset because the Boston schools had overspent the budget for about the 10th year in a row, and they asked Northeastern University if to put together a management team to look for sort of waste, fraud, and abuse and savings in the Boston schools. So Jack Curry, then the president, who had been a teacher and principal, I believe, turned to Bob Curry, the chief financial officer, who had been a partner at Price Waterhouse, or Coopers and Lybrand, I guess, and Bob Culver. They're all, those firms are merged today. And they spent at least 6 months documenting the fact that there were $20 million in savings and exactly which ones would work. And as his reward or punishment, depending, Bob Culver was named to the brand new appointed school committee, and he said that next year the budget was balanced for the first time in memory, and that was one of the achievements, one of the contributions of Northeastern contributing a vice president. One of the ideas in the Northeastern report that I liked was that there should be an ombudsman. Instead of people calling the school committee members and complaining and having their staffs run around and harass the staffs, I said there should be an official complaint person. In Sweden, there's a position called Ombudsman. And I had recommended that back in 1972-73, and I was delighted when Bob Culver reinstated the idea, and Tom Payson thought it was a good idea, and so he put it in, and there's been one the last few. She gets several thousand complaints a year, a lot of them special ed, transportation, people missing the bus, ways to improve the bus routes, safety, and the like. And it's a great safety valve on education. Northeastern has been a partner with Technical High School, now the John O'Bryant Technical High School, which is so appropriate. John O'Bryant was a member of the all-elected school committee. He was chairman during some of the very tough times of budget cutting. And then he was named an officer of Northeastern University and was a vice president here. And they renamed Technical High School, which has always been intended as the Math Science High School in Boston, for his name. So it's doubly appropriate for Northeastern, with a fabulous School of Engineering, Computer Science, and the like, to be teamed up with Boston Technical High School. So Northeastern has a splendid record, and I come in part to acknowledge it and to say that it gets very positive mention in the book. One issue of Boston School, how do you know they're good? Well, one is how many people get jobs at the end of the 12th grade and how many people go to college. And those numbers, 50 years ago, The only people going to college would be those going to boys Latin and girls Latin and technical high school. The notion was that technical high school students should be going to places like MIT and Northeastern with engineering schools. But the other 13 or 14, the neighborhood high schools, you know, you graduated into sheet metal, agriculture, carpentry, electricity, and the like. There was no feeling that you should go on to high school. Ray Flynn graduated from South Boston High School, and he read one book, and it was about a sports hero, because he was into athletics. And he'd go around telling people, I just read this terrific book. Well, that's the good news. But the bad news is it was the only book he read. And then he wound up at Providence College, 30 hours a week playing basketball. I mean, that's the kind of preparation. And he was a leader, and he became articulate and effective as a school reformer. But it wasn't the strong academic base out of South Boston High School or any of the neighborhood high schools. Now the numbers range from 30 to about 70% apply to and go on to college, half of them to community college. And Northeastern keeps the scoreboard. Andy Sum and his Center for Labor Studies does a scoreboard every year. They make phone calls. They find out where do people go. That's the good news, that the percentage of people going to college has increased dramatically. The bad news is that half of them drop out within a year or two. The academic preparation still is not strong enough. So that's one of the frontiers for Carol Johnson, the new superintendent, and for the universities to figure out how can we shore up the curriculum, middle school as well as high school. I mean, reading is not something you just teach in the first 2 or 3 grades. Reading's got to be taught in the upper elementary, the middle school, and high school. You've got to have the technical vocabulary, the scientific vocabulary, or else students will get discouraged. It's either too hard, or in some cases it's too easy. The shocking statistics about Boston is a third of the students who drop out have passed the MCAS. They've met the minimum state skills, but they don't find school relevant. It's boring, and so we've got to find ways to link them into early college, you know, maybe take some community college courses in grades 10, 11, and 12, Roxbury Community College or Bunker Hill, Quincy College, whatever, to try to entice them and get them so that there'll be opportunities for them to succeed in life. The final reference in the book to Northeastern is to an excellent study done by Professor John Ports, who just happens to be in the audience. Back in the 80s, he was looking at 3 cities, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Boston. And he awarded the first prize at that time to Pittsburgh, which hired a superintendent of schools, Richard Wallace from Fitchburg, Mass., who was really interested in achievement and using test score data. He had a lot of help from the University of Pittsburgh, which I think John had a federal R&D center for instructional improvement. Great help from 3 or 4 foundations, and best of all, the support of the Allegheny Conference, which is the Mellon Bank and the Heinz ketchup country. We know now Mrs. John Kerry has plenty of ketchup, and Bayonne, and they all work together beautifully to make achievement. Now, something went wrong, John, in the last 10 years because Pittsburgh fell so far that the foundations were boycotting. They said, we're not going to give any further grants. But they've been saved by another Massachusetts leader, Mark Roosevelt, who was an author of the State Educational Reform Act in Massachusetts. He signed up for a very special program financed by the Eli Broad Foundation, where they would take people from industry or from politics or public administration and transform them into superintendents. He now is the Pittsburgh. So you're going to have to get another grant to find out whether Mark Roosevelt has brought them back up to the level that you identified in the late 80s and 90s. John's critique of Boston is that the business community was very passive and quiet, did not appear to be leading, and left all the initiative to the mayor, which is true. Mayor Menino, along with Mayor Richard Daley in Chicago, appear to be the leading mayors who are for improving the schools. In fact, I argue in the book, the business community supported the Private Industry Council, the Boston Compact. They raised about $15 million for the Boston Plan for Excellence, which is an urban school improvement foundation, still going, and which has attracted Annenberg Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Gates Foundation money for Boston. I mean, $100 million in the past 10 years under Superintendent Tom Payson. And that resulted in the test score, the successful 10th grade scores moving from 30% of the students up to about 80% of the students. Boston schools need further improvement? Yes. We still have 40 or 50% of the students dropping out. There is still a minority achievement gap. There aren't enough hours in the day. We haven't yet figured out how to mobilize local libraries and the Boys and Girls Clubs and the social service agencies to really press and support students so that they will stay in school through graduation. There's at least another decade of work to be done. I see in some of the education publications, we're going to change the name of No Child Left Behind because so many children have been left behind. People are saying, well, maybe it should be changed to the Teach to the Test Act. Oh, no, that won't work. Or Every Child Above Average, which would be Garrison Keillor's nomination for Lake Wobegon phenomena. There will be some restyling, and not enough money was put into the effort. Teachers need a lot of support. We've got to be less punitive. We've got to stop punishing schools for not quite making it, or for making it in 2 or 3 categories, but not in special ed, or not in maybe one particular category out of 4. It gets in the Globe, and people say that's a failing school. I'm not going to send my kid there, and that really disparages and works against the notion of educational improvement. So there's a lot more to do, but I wrote my 76 years, and John, you'll have to help train some scholars to do the next 76. I can take some questions and comments. I tempted John, said, John, we can argue a little bit, but go ahead, more from. Okay, good, there's a first. She wants LaValle Wilson to come back. Yep.
Hello. My question is that, remember when Judge Garrity, when he pulled down, we had plenty of time to work it out, but when he put it down, that they had to make the changes of the busing. I understand that he also has made a statement in the legal pace of it, that this was one time that the parents will be able to get more involved. For an example, when I came up as a child in Boston, and the teachers had a lot of control, and your parents couldn't say anything, or you couldn't go to Court Street. There was a lot of closed doors at that time. And since they've been enforcing so many, the parents through him have made it possible that parents can get more involved with their kids in school.
He put in school councils where there'd be black and white parents, and Hispanic and Asian in some cases, to advise the principal and to monitor what was going on and to find out what was going on. That was a big experiment. I mean, for every school in Boston to have a council of 8 or 10 actually required several thousand. One of the problems is the busing patterns were such that if you were a parent, you might have to go 2 or 3 miles into a neighborhood where you worried about your safety. And so it was a great concept, and we now have school councils in Boston. Half of the members teachers, and half of them are parents, and they interview teachers, they interview candidates for principal. So that particular reform has stuck, and there was more parent involvement today than there was 40, 50 years ago. What schools did you go to?
I went to Roxbury Memorial High School.
Roxbury Memorial, okay. Right.
This question is very important. When Governor Wells and Nucci was in office, they started making a big change or reform to have the children that were in special classes to now be put into regular classrooms. They felt that these children that were put into special class, that it was something that was wrong, that the teachers weren't teaching, they were just making an open up door, but the kids weren't really actually learning. Could you emphasize to me, what do you think to this day, now that the kids is all together, regardless of what their intellect or their visual activity is. How are those kids coming along?
The statistics are not reassuring. I still go to the meetings of the Boston Plan for Excellence, and the special ed kids, those with needs, are not progressing as well on the whole. There are exceptions. There's the Mary Lyon School out in Alston-Brighton, which is outstanding. Everyone passes it. And all those students, if they were in a regular class, in a regular school, would be acting out because they have difficulty containing their emotions. But the teachers are so well trained, and the techniques are good. This school with 120 students in it, everybody passes the MCAS. So that's the best. But the statistics overall are that it isn't that the special ed isn't working. It's just they're not making the progress. And maybe so a lot more has to be done. By the way, it wasn't Weldon Cellucci. It was Governor Francis Sargent back in 1973-74. I know because I was a Secretary of Education in the governor's cabinet, and we argued and testified for the bill. A couple of years later, then, the federal government passed a similar bill. So it's both state and federal that say there's got to be an individual plan, learning plan for each child, and we've got to strive towards inclusion, the least restrictive alternative. That was the language at the time, so that we don't segregate kids with special needs, some of whom may just have attention deficit disorder or a physical handicap. They should be integrated with the rest of the students. It's a noble ideal. We've got more work to do to make it effective. Question over here.
What do you think about the same amount of funding going to every school on a national level? Do you think that might help minimize the gap in achievement?
I think we may have to put above average amounts of money into certain neighborhoods and certain schools. I think the notion that we have the same amount, like 10,000 per student in every school, may not be sufficient. We've got to have longer school days. We've got to have more technology in the school. And so schools that are not performing well, rather than give them the same, we should be figuring out how to give them more. That was the original notion under Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act.
I mean, like schools who have lack of funding in the budget.
Yeah.
Versus another city that might have more.
Well, a school that's successful, maybe in the suburbs, they can get by on 10, 11,000 a year. Some of the inner city schools ought to have 15 or 20. So I would invest more money into certain schools if we want to get performance up. Yes?
In Boston, there's been a lot of changes in the past 10 years with bilingual education, and I was just curious your take on whether students with no English exposure should have immediate English exposure with no exposure to their native language, or if you should mainstream them right away. What your take on that would be?
Well, back in the 70s, I testified for the Bilingual Education Act. I thought allowing students to have 3 years of transition was about right. And the students coming in from Latin America, from Mexico, we shouldn't be erasing their home language. It'd be a better country if we could all speak fluently a second language, whether it was Spanish or French or Chinese or Arabic. You know, we could maybe achieve world peace if we had more people who were multilingual. That's been my strong feeling for a long, long time. Interestingly, it was the people of Massachusetts who voted 60% to put an end to bilingual education, with the exception of two-way magnet schools. So the Rafael Hernandez School in Roxbury is a two-way bilingual school. So if you're an Anglo parent, you can send your child there knowing that half the instructions are going to be in Spanish, and they'll come out the other side being fluent in Spanish and competent in English and do well. It's a very successful school. I think 3/4 of the teachers are Hispanic. And the two-way magnet is legal. It's the one-way that isn't. At some point, we may go back and revisit that, because I think bilingual education, one of the great things it did in Boston is it allowed Boston to hire 300 or 400 Hispanic people. Here we had several thousand Hispanic children, nobody to identify with in the school. So there was a kind of a bonus benefit. Well, it lasted. Yes?
What are your thoughts about what are your thoughts about the current budget crisis that the Boston Public Schools is facing right now, relative to, you know, some people say, well, you know, if you cut the busing, that you could pick up some money there. You know, they're talking about massive layoffs, you know, and some people are saying that really there's too much fat, you know, at Court Street, and that it's a shame to lay off so many young teachers. We've seen some of those layoffs before, so generally I'd like to know what your comments would be about the situation right now.
Well, we're in the early stages. We don't know how much of the stimulus package Mayor Menino will have to reduce cuts in police, fire, and it sounds pretty grim right now. I mean, something like 80 million, about 10% of the budget. You know, the Boston schools hit the high point of enrollment in the 1930s. I began deliberately when Boston had 130,000 students. Right now, they've got 55,000 students, so it's less than half. Now, there are 3,000 students in Metco, 3,000 or 4,000 people going to charter schools. There are 5,000 or 6,000 going to parochial schools. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of choice right now. Superintendent Johnson, it's not easy to close a school. People get so loyal to the school that they attended. But there probably is a case, looking at it sort of through a financial lens, for 5 to 8 schools to close down. They could close down the older schools. Problem is, over the last 30 years, we've been closing down more schools in Roxbury because they were the oldest schools, and they would cost the most to rehabilitate. So we have built some new schools, beginning with a trotter 25 years ago, and there's some new schools in Mattapan and Columbia Road. But, you know, there could be some trimming. But I heard the Superintendent Johnson say she could close down Court Street, everybody in the central office, and it would just make a small dent. That there's got to be some other reductions. I think the mayor will probably come in and on his horse and save them to an extent, but there will be some closings, if not this year, then next year. Yes?
I have a question about how, I know you said that there would be at least another decade of work before Boston is...
It's perfect, yeah.
But how, I guess, my question to you is, how long do you think it has taken or will take for the initiatives that Boston have taken, Bostonians, for it to resonate to other small towns and cities across the country, not just in Massachusetts? Because I know you showed us a chart, and this is slightly different, but in terms of the segregation and stuff, that, you know, Detroit was very high, and it was harder for them to do what Boston was doing just because of the population difference.
Yeah.
And, so I'm just wondering how...
Well, Boston should be a lighthouse for the rest of New England. The interesting thing is, back when things were as corrupt as I described, people paying for jobs and the like, nobody who went up the ranks in Boston was considered worthy of going to other school systems. Lo and behold, after the court order, one surprising side benefit is that all of a sudden, Boston educators were seen as pretty good. I mean, places like Milton and Brookline, which are relatively fancy suburbs, hired people who had been deputy superintendents in Boston. Jim Walsh in Brookline, Mary Grasser O'Neill in Milton, Bill Larry was superintendent of schools in Gloucester. 8 or 10 other communities hired Boston educators, feeling they could deal with serious problems. They could design solutions. So I think some of that process has begun already. But Boston's a special place. You know, Boston and Cambridge and Chelsea are ports of entry for people coming in from around the world. Whenever there's a revolution or a coup d'etat, people are coming in from Somalia. I mean, with virtually a few stitches on their back, with maybe no education for the 3 or 4 years. People are coming in 13, 14, 15 years of age, and we're trying to say, okay, we want to educate these people by the time they're 18. Well, it's going to take till 19 or 20 or 21. I worked on a task force that said, you know, we've got people coming in from other cities around the world and around the country who don't have the basic skills, and they're 14 years of age. And the expectation is everybody passes MCAS in the 10th grade, you know, when they're 16. There's something unrealistic about that. So Boston will continue to need help, and so will Chelsea, and so will several other communities that take in people from around the world. Yes, people who made millions in their 20s and 30s are going to want to see results, and they want to be involved. A good example in Massachusetts is Chris Gabrielli, who's run for governor and Congress and a few other jobs, but he's helped raise $20 million for after-school programs. But they've got measurement instruments galore. I mean, he's not just, here's some money, you do whatever you want. He wants to see achievement arising, and he's monitoring it, paying a great deal of attention. And people are saying, what a positive influence this guy is.
And are those educational experiences, opportunities connected in any way to a workforce, a workplace experience?
Sometimes. That has to be designed. I mean, there are a lot of people working on workforce development, beginning with the private industry council, but some of the social entrepreneurs don't have that as their basic. They want basic skills first, right, and then workforce will follow.
Vocational skills.
Yep. Yes. What a great group of asking questions. I'm delighted.
I just want to say thank you for being part of Boston Plan for Excellence. I'm a BTR resident, and I teach at Charlestown High School right now. My question is about your opinion and your experience with school choice, and a lot of over the past few years with BTR, a lot of these teacher residents are being hired by pilot schools, and it's sort of, I'm struggling with that. I'm a little disconcerted by it, just wanting to work in Boston public schools and being part of a school like Charlestown, which has a pretty awful reputation, but the students there, I think, are pretty wonderful. So I guess I just want to hear your comments about the concept of school choice, charter schools, pilot schools.
First of all, I'm very impressed by what Jesse Solomon has done as the leader of the Boston Teacher Residency. By the way, there were 2 congressmen from Illinois who said, this teacher residency program is really good. Let's write it into the Higher Education Act 2 years ago. Those congressmen, one of which was Barack Obama, and the other was Rahm Emanuel, who's the chief of staff. And believe me, we're going to see more teacher residency programs, maybe in 2 dozen cities in the next 2 or 3 years. So that model is really, really good. You raised some interesting questions about school choice. I'm currently doing a study out in Franklin County in Western Mass. It's Deerfield and Greenfield and a bunch of hill towns, 25 of them to be exact. And what's happening is that people are leaving the impoverished schools and going to sort of the middle-class schools, and that further drains down the money and the morale of people in the schools. So there's a side to school choice that really is debilitating and at least somewhat destructive. The parents who flee an underperforming school may be happy, but the bad school gets worse is the risk. So Val Patrick has listened to the enthusiasts for school choice, and he said, let's have something called readiness schools, which could be, the teachers would stay in the union. In fact, he said, you could have 10 or 15 teachers, for example, alums of the Boston Teacher Residency, say, we have a great idea for a new school in Charlestown. Could we have the money? Because we'll work 10 hours a day. We'll work Saturdays. We'll do whatever's needed. We'll go to the homes. We'll get the parents into the schools. And these readiness schools would result in students being ready for college and ready for careers. That's Val Patrick's dream. Now, there haven't been any yet. There'll probably be some pilot grants in the next couple of years. But that's the new way of looking at it. They have some of the ingredients of pilot schools, some of charter schools. They would be called readiness schools. So we will be watching that with great interest. Bob.
I just comment. One is, you asked earlier if the language in the mission statement about Northeastern being a friend of the city was still there. That language is not there, but in terms of our commitment to the city and education is a part of what Northeastern continues to be. And one of the things you referenced was the study done by Andy Sum that talked about the issue, the failure of persistence in terms of kids graduating once they enter higher education. I just wanted to mention that one of the things that we have started is what's known as Foundation Year, and it's a program for students who have graduated or have a GED to have that first year of college with surrounding them with support both for social issues, financial issues, and giving them that first year in higher education to help them succeed.
That's great. That's going to be
along the lines of what you were suggesting.
We're
starting that this coming July.
Wonderful. Good. Yeah. Oh, that was Nick just reaching for the camera. Yep. Yes.
I was wondering, and I don't know too much about this, but I've read in some op-eds recently about this movement to neighborhood schools again, and people who are against busing, and I was wondering if you had any comments.
Well, right now, it's moved from the emphasis being on busing for desegregation to busing for choice. People say, I really like a school, it's 3 miles away, and I'm so pleased I have the right to go. They're saying this costs something like $60, $70 million. If we could cut that in half, we wouldn't have to lay off 200 teachers. So that's the trade-off. They're saying people go to parochial schools can hop on the bus. So it's sort of open to all, but it's a very, transportation, the price of gas. Some of these buses only have 3 or 4 people in them. People say, let's take a hard look at it. Have we gone too far in offering choice? Why can't we focus on improving schools nearby so that kids and parents don't have to go 3 or 4 miles to go to a parent meeting or meet the teacher? I'm not sure how that's going to come out, but it's being looked at very hard because of the financial crunch.
Do you think that the city's diversity has changed enough, obviously, from when the desegregation order was needed, so that if we limit choice or change the choice options, like you said, that we won't put ourselves at risk of segregation?
There's no appetite on the part of the federal courts, and I don't think in the NAACP to go chasing after people because the court has become more conservative. The recent decisions are very strict in terms of what they will allow. So, I was in favor of the racial imbalance law and then later I went to Illinois and helped desegregate 10 cities, including Abraham Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, and feel very good about that work. But the controlled choice would be, okay, why do we have to say the 3 kids in the family, one's going to Jamaica Plain, one's going to Dorchester, one's going to Charleston? Why can't we take, a zone in the city and have 4 or 5 really interesting choices within a mile and make those schools flower rather than people abandoning schools? Or if they're not great, if they're not attractive schools or successful schools, maybe those are the ones that we should be closing down, 5 or 8 of them, and create some new readiness schools. We've got to find some new solutions, and we want equity, and we want as much balance and diversity as possible. Those are important values. Yes.
You see the relationship between private industry and the public education system growing in-house? The readiness schools, for example, would that be sponsored by, say, a company?
I have a fairly tough chapter. We are so proud of the fact that the business community form partnerships, and the Boston Plan for Excellence arranges for 50 CEOs to go visit a Boston schools. And when they meet people like the Boston teacher residents, faculty, and they meet a principal who's really committed, and they meet the kids, it transforms their view. But have corporations really invested heavily? No. And too often, they assigned their community relations, their public relations staff, and they had 3 or 4 people monitor the project. Most of the employees didn't know that they had a partnership school. One partnership that got a lot of positive wound up being partnered with the Jeremiah Burke High School, which lost accreditation. And people said, my God, how can you take pride in a partnership with a school that has been sliding down? Shouldn't the corporate role be to protest and to go see the mayor and use their clout to get more resources, or maybe invest more resources in it? So the chapter I have on I have chapters, 2 chapters on teachers, one before collective bargaining, one after collective bargaining. I've got 1 chapter on corporations, 1 on universities, and they haven't been perfect either. Northeastern's done a lot of great things, but in some cases, some universities were doing 30 things. And the superintendent of Payson came in and he said, they're doing 30 things, but the achievement isn't going up. Why don't they do 2 or 3 things? Would they come and listen to us, and we will tell them what the strategy is, and we want their help on 2 or 3 things, not 20 or 30. So you had Project-itis, he called it. So same way with business.
Has BU Academy, which has been successful. Do you see other universities creating high schools?
Well, you know, I went to Boston College High School, well, which back in the 1860s, I wasn't there then, but they had a high school. BU, that's a pretty elite program. I mean, you've got to have very high preliminary scholastic aptitude or SSAT scores to get in. And, I mean, those are brilliant students. And by year 3, I took a tour of BU Academy. I mean, BU has to get a lot of credit, and they get it in the book because 3 times BU volunteered to run the entire Boston school system. And in the end, they get Chelsea. Not as a consolation prize, but there's 7 new schools, and they've moved test scores up. They've got early childhood programs in Chelsea right now. BU has done some great things. I'm not sure. Yeah, the answer. A number of foundations are putting money into what they call early college opportunities for 10th and 12th. 10th, 11th, 12th graders. That's in Governor Patrick's readiness program. Unfortunately, there's no money in the state to fund it this year, but there'll be some planning grants. I think we'll see an effort to get more 9, 10, 11, 12, especially 11th and 12th students who maybe are bored in high school, get them in a community college challenging course and have them move in. The other innovation we're going to see more of is virtual high schools, online courses, beginning with advanced placement. A lot of high schools in Massachusetts only have 1 or 2 advanced placement courses. Online, you can have 15, 20, or 30. So that's something we're going to see in the next 10 years. It's already begun. Okay, 1 more. Here we are. 2 more.
What is your thought on attracting the best teachers to work on the days?
Well, I think the Boston Teacher Residency is a strategy, and it's amazing. Chicago, Denver have very dynamic programs. The schools of education have had the franchise and haven't had any competition, but now all of a sudden it's happening. And I mean, there's 220 teachers, I think, have gone through the BTR in the past 4 years. A lot of them are in math and science, which are the schools of education, the universities haven't been able to find enough people wanting to teach science and math. So also Teach for America is another innovation that's taken, outstanding students from colleges and universities around the country, and that's getting up to several thousand teachers. So we've got to find some new creative ways. There are teachers who will say, look, we're committed. We don't know if we're going to work 3, 4, or 5 years, but while we are, we're going to give it everything. And that's very hopeful. Yes?
You're talking about, there's been a big argument up in City Hall about the residency. Now, Dapper, and I was told, he was telling me that he was showing me how many teachers has been coming in, how much it would cost the city at the time. Now it came up again, who's his name? Chris Iannella, he put it down that he said it's for Boston, it's for everything. Now it's coming up that if a person's here in Massachusetts and they got their education degree, a lot of people feel that they cannot afford to live in Boston, so they may go to the suburbs. So it looks like it's a catch-22.
Yeah. Well, even the police who were required to live in the city were able to break that. So
they could have been here,
yeah.
But they have moved.
Yeah. Right.
And
I think that issue has subsided. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, down the south end, it has changed tremendously with a lot of occasions where you have people different clientele. And apparently, what my observation were, and I talked to some people about it, they stay there, they get married, get professionals, and then they get married, and they may buy the little townhouse or they may, and when they get ready, they have the little children. When that child gets 5 years old, they leave. So you don't see too much of, when you look in the schoolhouse, you don't see too many Caucasian kids versus with the black kids. And we're not talking about minorities. We've got Haitian, Spanish, Puerto Rican, you know, that kind of diversity. The city has changed so much. It's been a lot of fights. It's still going on fight to change. And I think another thing is very important that we seem to be forgetting, that a lot of the children may be dropouts because some of them has gotten in trouble with the drug war for violence, or the parents have lost a child and they have 3, and they've been going and leaving, going up to other places. So, you know, the picture has been really drastically crazy since 1999 and right on because the violence has surged. So you all have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Good. Yes, last question?
I have 2 questions. One is, will we be seeing greater equity in the exam schools? I would say, based upon my research, about 97% of the Caucasian kids who are in the Boston Public Schools are in the exam schools. And the second question is, I'd like to know if your reactions or your feelings about the impact that the Boston Teacher Union has on teacher quality here in the city of Boston.
2 blockbuster questions, yeah. Wow, I was hoping a couple of easy ones, Bob, at the end. The equity, one of the things that I really admire about the Latin School alumni is that a number of them have gotten involved in coaching 7th and 8th grade, 5th and 6th graders to get them ready, including students of color. And these are Caucasian alums, and they're saying, okay, I'm going to commit to 10 Saturdays and get people ready for the test. So there's effort not only by the educators, but by the graduates of a Latin school to see if they can't turn things around. That's very positive. Boston Teachers Union has a very strong group that defends the status quo. There's a lot of teachers in Massachusetts, not just in Boston, who would repeal No Child Left Behind, who would repeal MCAS and the message, say, let's go back to where it was. It was much more comfortable. We had complete freedom to teach what we wanted to, no tests, no humiliation of being in the Globe. So there's as I say, it's not confined to the Boston Teachers Union. It's true. I just did a survey in Western Mass, and parents and teachers, are not that enchanted by the push for higher standards. And yet many people feel, 20 years from now, one of George Bush's few accomplishments will be, he exposed the fact that schools were achieving unequal levels, and he publicized the achievement gap. And we've got to face it, we've got to deal with it. We can't just sweep it under the table. So I wouldn't single out the Boston teachers. Most of the education profession has many qualms, and we will see some changes come out in the next 6 or 8 months. And in fact, if Bob Gittins lets us all go home, we can watch Obama and see if President Obama, and see if he has a few ideas that he's going to leak about education. Thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate it.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Cronin for